Interesting. Chris wants to know, what if Bret never left? A few possible items, not blaming Bret, but Owen would have never become the Blue Blazer again. Davey wouldn't have broken his back in WCW. Shawn wouldn't have hurt his back in the casket match. Rick Rude wouldn't have left the WWF. Maybe he would have gotten cleared to wrestle on Raw. It is interesting to think, what if Bret would have stuck around? Respectfully, it probably wouldn't have changed WCW at all, but it could have changed the WWF and a lot of other people's lives.
Yeah, right? I know Bret Hart's got a lot of great fans out there, and he's earned them. He's one of the greatest technical performers in the ring at a very, very high level. I'm not taking anything at all away from what Bret accomplished in the ring or what his capabilities were. However, as I like to say, I just get excited when I say, however, whose fault is it that Bret put a $20 million price tag on himself? Who thought that was a good idea? It was an astronomical ask. One might say pretty freaking greedy. One might even say he knew what he was doing, and he knew he had Vince over a barrel, so he was going to squeeze every nickel out of him he could. And he did, until he didn't. But had Bret settled for a reasonable contract, I guarantee you Vince would not have let him go. He just couldn't hang with 20 million. He couldn't. He wanted to. He couldn't. But a reasonable ask that would have made probably Bret still the highest paid person on the roster, Bret would have never stepped foot in WCW.
Eric, I don't think it was a $20 million ask. I think it was a 20-year deal. I think that's where the 20 comes from. I don't think it was 20 million.
How much per year? Do you know?
I don't expect you to. It was a lot more than the active years, but the ambassador years, like the back 9 of that contract, it was like $500,000 a year or something.
Well, either way, Bret put a price tag on Bret.
Yes.
And it was a price tag that Vince couldn't afford. Bret had the option to sit down with Vince and say, okay, let's redo our deal.
That's interesting. Charlie Thrower says, what if Bret said yes to Vince's pay cut? 6 months from Montreal, he had the money. Had Bret stayed, would that still happen? Would Austin have been allowed to become the megastar? Would Shawn still have been in the casket match that destroyed his back? Would we even get Mr. McMahon? Now that's the big what if.
Wow, that's a giant one. Wow.
Because if Bret stays, he doesn't screw him. We don't get the Bret screwed Bret promo. We don't get Mr. McMahon. So if Bret stays, maybe Mr. McMahon doesn't become a character. Maybe Raw never beats Nitro. In a weird way, it works out a lot differently if Bret stays.
That is crazy. You know what's crazy about it? As either one of those moments within that whole butterfly effect, any one of those things is not out of the question.
Yes.
This isn't like some wacky, what if, hypothetical that you've got to be high to even really engage in. This is something that easily could have occurred. Bret could have. Had I never met Bret the year before, if we didn't have that relationship, you think Bret would have come over?
No.
I don't either. And if we wouldn't have had that one meeting at the restaurant near the Santa Monica airport, we wouldn't have had that one meeting, and Bret and I got to know each other. And I'm not regretting that, but I don't want to make it sound like that at all. I was very happy to meet Bret and proud of it. Still have a couple gifts he gave me afterwards, but he wouldn't have come. And then that list of things that was the catalyst for this question, Rick Rude wouldn't have left, HBK in a casket match, all the things that, I think there were 5 things on that list. Conceivably, it never would have happened, but Conrad, you knocked it out of the park with, we wouldn't have seen Stone Cold Steve, likely would not have seen Stone Cold Steve Austin or the Mr. McMahon component of it, which is, I think, what got Stone Cold Steve Austin really off into orbit. Wow. That's a really cool question. I appreciate that one.
RCS88 says, what if Brian Pillman didn't have the Humvee accident in 96? Man, you want to talk about an interesting character, an interesting mind for the business. And we know his life was cut way too short in October of 97. But without that Humvee accident, maybe we don't have that reliance on painkillers and we don't have some of those same troubles, and we would have been able to wrestle. And, you know, this is a guy who not too terribly long before this was seen as a real innovator. I mean, his matches with Jushin Thunder Liger were light years ahead of time. And then we saw him reinvent himself, and he became this crazy loose cannon character. Brian Pillman, a healthy Brian Pillman who never has the accident. Man, that changes a lot of things, doesn't it?
That would have been wicked cool. I just watched a clip. I think it was one of WWE's most controversial moments. And the scene where Steve Austin breaks into Brian and Melanie's house.
Yeah.
Brian pulls out a gun. I watched that scene last night. And I didn't even think about the fact we were going to be doing this show, but Brian Pillman was off the charts good.
Yes.
Even seeing him last night made me realize how and I've always appreciated Brian. I've always thought he was a next level kind of talent, but I watched that scene last night and I'm thinking, man, there's very few people that had that magic that Brian had. Kind of like Scott Hall. If you could have kept him straight, he had drugs, you know, it's not like they wanted it to end the way it did. They got sucked into it. And a lot of people did. Painkillers were like candy. You could get them anywhere. Doctors were giving them out. FDA said, sure, take all that stuff you want. It's not addictive. Cut to where we are today. And Brian and Scott got caught up in that, like a lot of other people did. So I don't mean to sound critical of either one of them is what I'm trying to say. However, if you could imagine the world without those issues in it for either one or both of those guys. Scott Hall was amazing. He had an amazing mind. He knew how to, he just knew he had an instinct that you can't teach. That's the best way to say it. And Brian Pillman was right there with him. Maybe more so in some ways. So yeah, what a different world that would have been.
Can you imagine in this hypothetical, Brian doesn't have the accident, so he's not going to lose his life in October of 97. Can you imagine if and when he jumped back to WCW? I mean, when he comes back into a Nitro NWO era of WCW with the worked shoot promo. I mean, we saw when Sean Waltman makes his Raw debut fresh off of a WCW run and he does his worked shoot promo against you. Man, Pillman had been trying to do that for a while with this loose cannon thing. And if he came back in and we're trying to lean into the reality, the worked shoot promos he could have had about WCW, about Vince McMahon, about the screw job, about everything, it would have been wild, man. Brian Pillman in an alternate timeline has so much success during the Attitude Era, don't you think?
If it could have played out the way you just, quickly laid out, we'd be talking about Brian Pillman, Mount Rushmore type of conversations.
Yeah. Fascinating. TW Cool T says, what if Goldberg went to the WWF instead of the power plant? Would he still have become as big of a star as he became? Now that's interesting. We've talked about some of these what ifs before, like what if Kurt Angle came to WCW? Because it almost happened. I mean, he was at least interested, and Rick said, no, go to Vince McMahon. But Goldberg, you've talked about it before here on the show. You were supposed to follow up with him, and it slipped through your fingers. You forgot. You almost didn't wrangle him. He almost did go to the WWF. I don't know that they would have leaned into the streak and built him that way. And as I'm saying that out loud, I'm reminded, well, they kind of did it with the Ultimate Warrior, but it didn't really work when they did it with
which is why they wouldn't have done it with Bill.
So what do you think? What does Goldberg's career look like if he goes to Vince instead of the power plant?
I don't think it would have lasted long. that transition, it was hard enough for Bill to walk away from football and step into professional wrestling. It was emotionally hard for him. I don't say hard. It wasn't comfortable initially, the thought. But Bill had a lot of friends in Atlanta, was able to stay living in Atlanta, wasn't wrestling in an OVW show. I don't see it. Now, if they would have had a performance center back then, cool. But what was going on back in, I'm sure they were either with Cornette or they were with OVW, or OVW's Cornette, or it was at one point. But he would have been coming up the way Dave Bautista did. I don't think Bill wouldn't have put up with it. He wouldn't have tolerated that stage of his development if it would have been in WWE, because it would have been much more demanding and uncomfortable because he'd be away from home.